History books will tell you that the 1071 Battle of Manzikert was an epic clash, won through the sound of swords and a rain of arrows. But what if the ultimate fate of this great turning point was determined not by frontline heroics, but by a fatal logistical decision made miles away from the battlefield, and a systematic betrayal within the chain of command? In this academic analysis, we are setting aside the classic fairy tale that has been told for centuries. Our objective is to dissect the silent logistical collapse within the Eastern Roman military machine with forensic precision. In the coming minutes, we will unravel, step by step, the stages of that strategic suicide, initiated by Emperor Romanos Diogenes when he shifted his heaviest infantry and siege units, numbering 20 to 30,000 men, south to Chliat, right before the battle. In the heat of August, you will witness the merciless drought of the high-altitude volcanic lava plain, the Seljuk brilliance that secured the water sources days in advance, and the physical exhaustion caused by the heavy Klibanion armor worn by the soldiers in all its stark reality. Those fatal disconnections in the communication lines of the Frankish, Norman, Pecheneg and Oghuz mercenaries who formed the backbone of the army. How Sultan Arslan etched his quadruple crescent formation onto the plains of Manzikert with mathematical precision. And finally, that dark command disaster culminating in Andronikos Doukas deliberately withdrawing the reserve forces. All of this will be mapped out step by step in the light of historical data. However, before we begin the tactical autopsy of that hot August day that sealed the fate of Eastern Rome, join this academic archive by subscribing to our channel, because history doesn't just reside in the past. It resurrects right now in the minds of those of you listening to these words from different corners of the world, at different hours of the day. Leave your own mark on this dark archive by noting down your current geography and time. If you are ready, let's begin. Beginning in the mid-1060s, the centuries-old defensive architecture of the Eastern Roman Empire across the Anatolian plateau entered a phase of structural fracturing under the weight of continuous and asymmetrical incursions from the east. The traditional military and agricultural organizational hierarchy, known as the Thema system, proved increasingly inadequate in reacting to the high mobility and deep penetration capabilities of the Turkmen cavalry. The military infrastructure of strategically vital eastern provinces, such as Vaspurakan and Ani, had sustained severe damage, and the flow of tax revenues and agricultural yields to the capital had been disrupted to a critical degree. Seeking to halt this geopolitical erosion, restore order, and permanently fortify the eastern frontiers through a decisive military victory, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes resolved to launch a massive military expedition from Constantinople in the spring of 1071. In the second week of March, the Eastern Roman military machine mobilized from the capital. Crossing the Bosphorus to the Asian shore at Chrysopolis, the forces initiated one of the largest and most complex logistical operations in the empire's history up to that era. As indicated by military records and historical literature, the combined total of combat forces and logistical support elements amounted to approximately 40,000 men. This colossal force was not comprised solely of elite tagmata regiments and infantry. It dragged behind it a massive siege train that reflected the engineering capacity of the empire. Disassembled components of colossal trebuchets, ballistae, the wooden frameworks of siege towers, and tons of iron munitions, all hauled by hundreds of ox carts, constituted the primary limiting factor that dictated the army's rate of advance. In pre-modern military logistics, the daily progression capacity of ox carts bearing heavy loads is restricted to 15 to 20 kilometers, even under the most ideal road conditions. However, as the army advanced eastward from Helenopolis to Ancyra and onward through Sebastia, modern Sivas, the rugged steppes, dried riverbeds, and climatic fluctuations of central Anatolia transformed this march into a profoundly cumbersome, friction-laden, and grueling endeavor. The daily water, grain, and fodder requirements for a human mass of 40,000, alongside tens of thousands of mounts and pack animals, rapidly depleted the agricultural lands and water sources along the route. As the army pushed further east, the supply lines stretching from the center grew increasingly strained, leaving the supply chain at the mercy of the local geography's limited resources. By the time they reached Sebastia, the initial breakdowns in communication and lapses in discipline among the diverse ethnic groups within the army, including Franks, Normans, Slavs, Armenians, and Georgians, had begun to manifest as symptoms of the physical and psychological exhaustion induced by this arduous transit. While the Byzantine army climbed with heavy steps toward Theodosiopolis, modern Erzurum, thousands of kilometers to the south, an entirely different strategic axis was taking shape. During this period, Great Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan was marching against the Egypt-based Fatimid Caliphate, which he perceived as his primary geopolitical rival and ideological adversary. The Seljuk army had laid siege to the citadel of Aleppo and was deep into the logistical preparations for a southward descent through the Syrian corridor. However, upon receiving intelligence that the Eastern Roman Empire was advancing eastward with a massive army and heavy siege weaponry, Alp Arslan altered his entire set of strategic priorities with a radical decision. The siege of Aleppo was immediately lifted. This decision triggered one of the most dramatic and rapid strategic pivot maneuvers in military history. Leaving behind cumbersome siege equipment, slow-moving infantry units and heavy baggage, Alp Arslan initiated a grueling forced march northward with his most elite and highly mobile horse archer detachments. The logistical difficulties encountered during the rapid crossing of the Euphrates River, the casualties lost to the currents, and the sheer exhaustion of the mounts were among the inevitable costs of this strategic acceleration maneuver. Yet, rather than heading to the city of Ryi to gather reinforcements, the Sultan's primary objective was to divert his route directly north, forcing the Byzantine army into a heavyweight engagement within a geography of his own choosing, where he had preemptively secured the supply lines. Thus, by the midsummer months of 1071, the Eastern Anatolian geography was hurtling toward an inevitable collision of two diametrically opposed military philosophies. On one side advanced the Eastern Roman heavy infantry machine, a slow but seemingly unstoppable mass burdened by tons of armor, massive siege engines, and supply lines stretched to the breaking point over hundreds of kilometers. On the other side stood the Seljuk apparatus of war, built upon speed, maneuverability, real-time intelligence, and aerodynamic flexibility, wholly embracing the doctrine of light cavalry. As the Byzantine army reached the elevation of Theodosiopolis, exceeding 1,900 meters, the merciless realities of the terrain began to assert themselves more clearly. The march, conducted under the scorching sun by day and the freezing cold of high altitude by night, combined with the low atmospheric oxygen levels, severely restricted the physical capacity of the heavily armored soldiers and increased their fatigue index geometrically. The weight of the lamella armor, the Klibanion, enveloping the soldiers' torsos, was not merely a physical burden, it was the harbinger of an impending tactical catastrophe. When the Eastern Roman army reached the environs of Theodosiopolis, modern-day Erzurum, in the midsummer of 1071, after weeks of grueling and ponderous transit, the first severe strategic fractures had begun to emerge within the internal dynamics of the military machine. The Erzurum plain, with its elevation exceeding 1,900 meters, was not merely a physical climatic barrier. It was the ultimate military tribunal where the future of the campaign would be decided. In the war, council convened in the headquarters tent, the Kriegsrat in military terminology, an irreparable doctrinal schism manifested between the army's senior staff and the emperor. The commander of the left wing, Nikephoros Bryennios, a seasoned general who had acquired extensive experience in irregular warfare in the Balkans, advised that the army should hold its ground, leveraging the fortification advantage provided by Theodosiopolis. Bryennios's strategy was predicated on securing logistical lines and forcing the Seljuk army either to attack them in this rugged terrain or to withdraw, leaving scorched earth behind. This approach aligned perfectly with military rationality and Rome's centuries-old principles of defense and attrition warfare. However, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes' decisions were dictated not by the rationality of the front line, but by the political fragility of his throne. The emperor was compelled to secure an absolute visual and indisputable pitched battle victory against his rivals in the capital. This political imperative shelved all military caution, and the order was given for the army to advance southeastward toward the Lake Van Basin. As the army departed Erzurum and entered the rugged volcanic terrain stretching south along the Murat River valley, the foundations of one of the most lethal tactical blunders in military history were laid. Upon reaching the plains northwest of the Manzikert fortress, Romanos Diogenes physically divided his army in two, relying on flawed intelligence that suggested the enemy's main force was still far away, presumably deep within Iran or near Baghdad. This division was not a simple tactical detachment or a flank security maneuver. It was the self-paralysis of a colossal military force. The emperor dispatched a contingent of approximately 20 to 30,000 men, constituting the most elite and striking power of the army, under the command of the experienced general Joseph Tarchanaiotis, and the leader of the Norman mercenaries, Roussel de Bailleul, to the south to besiege the fortress of Chliat, Arlat, and secure the southern line. This force contained heavily armoured Frankish and Norman cavalry, crack infantry units, and the army's siege engineers. The distance between Manzikert and Chliat is approximately 50 kilometers as the crow flies. Yet considering the foothills of the volcanic Mount Sufan, the precipitous passes, and the arid terrain conditions of August, these 50 kilometers represented a distance that would take days to traverse for pre-modern military logistics. As the force under Tarchanaiotes vanished over the southern horizon, Romanos Diogenes had single-handedly halved his own main army, pushing a massive portion of his heavy infantry and kinetic shock capacity out of the theatre of operations. In an era devoid of radio communication or synchronous signaling networks, the rugged topography instantly severed any communicative bond between the two army groups. In military geopolitics, this act literally equated to the creation of a logistical fault line. Underlying this strategic suicide was the absolute collapse of the Eastern Roman intelligence network. Byzantine vanguard units and spies, blinded by the topographical barriers of the geography they traversed and the anti-intelligence screens deployed by Seljuk light cavalry, could not see beyond their own horizon line. The Romanos headquarters was entirely unaware that Alp Arslan had lifted the siege of Aleppo and rapidly advanced north, masterfully concealing his forces and taking up positions mere dozens of kilometers south of Manzikert. The root of this intelligence blindness was not solely geographical. The Eastern Roman staff had structurally miscalculated the maneuverability of the Seljuk army. Byzantine doctrine modeled the movement speed of a large army upon its own cumbersome logistical capacity. The reality that Alp Arslan, after departing Aleppo, could advance northward at an astonishing rate of up to 50 kilometers a day, utilizing a relay system, spare mounts, and abandoning heavy siege baggage, was a contingency that simply did not exist on the cognitive maps of the Byzantine staff. Conversely, the Seljuk intelligence network operated with flawless and asymmetrical efficiency. Local elements familiar with the region's geography and continuously mobile Turkmen horse archers relayed every step the Byzantine army took, every camp they established, and crucially, the exact moment the army was bifurcated directly to Sultan Alp Arslan in real time. The Seljuk command observed with mathematical certainty how Romanos Diogenes systematically dismantled his own numerical superiority, tracking precisely how far the forces heading to Chliat had distanced themselves from the main body. As late August approached, the Byzantine headquarters on the Manzikert plain was steeped in profound silence and conceptual delusion. Within the command tents, plans were being devised not for a brutal pitched battle, but for an effortless fortress siege followed by a political victory to be paraded in the capital. Meanwhile, kilometers to the south, the army of Joseph Tarchanaiotis, heading toward Chliat, had resolved to entirely abandon the theatre of war and retreat westward, a decision the precise cause of which military historians continue to debate. Certain records indicate these units panicked upon encountering Seljuk vanguards, while others point to blatant treason by the mercenary commanders fleeing the impending conflict. Whatever the reason, the outcome was absolute. Romanos Diogenes remained blissfully ignorant that the colossal army he had sent to Chliat would never return. The emperor was unaware that his flanks would be left unprotected, and that he was now left alone on the Manzikert plain against the entirety of the Seljuk war apparatus. The entire chain of logistical errors and the intelligence vacuum had set the stage with millimeter precision for the imminent demographic and military devastation. In the early hours of August 24, 1071, the fine dust clouds drifting over the arid topography of the Manzikert plain were the first physical manifestations of the impending structural catastrophe. The Eastern Roman Central Command had established a massive tent city just a few kilometers from the fortress. However, the daily water and forage requirements for tens of thousands of soldiers and thousands of pack animals dictated a logistical necessity, forcing the army to continuously expand outward. The imperial foraging parties were compelled to venture increasingly further from the main camp to secure provisions. Toward noon, these unarmed and dispersed supply columns advancing southeast suddenly encountered the vanguard of Seljuk horse archers concealed behind the rolling hills. The initial contact unfolded not as a traditional challenge, but as a premeditated operation of annihilation. When intelligence of the attack on the supply columns reached the main camp, the commander of the left wing, Nikephoros Bryennios, was dispatched with a limited cavalry contingent to intervene. Operating under the assumption that these skirmishes were merely another instance of the small-scale hit-and-run tactics they had faced for days, Bryennios advanced into the hilly terrain. Yet, as the afternoon wore on, Bryennios's forces found themselves ensnared within an ambush ring calculated with mathematical precision. The force confronting them was no disorganized band of raiders. It was the lethal vanguard of great Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan's main army. In this first serious engagement, the fatal asymmetry between the military doctrines of the two armies was laid bare. As the Byzantine heavy cavalry struggled to build momentum under the immense weight of their armor and barding, the Seljuk horse archers maintained a constant out-of-range distance, exploiting the superior aerodynamic capacity of their composite bows. The Parthian shot tactic, feigning retreat only to pivot in the saddle and unleash a barrage of arrows, inflicted heavy casualties on the Roman ranks. While the short, armor-piercing arrows could not easily penetrate the shield walls of the heavy infantry, they struck the unarmored sections of the horses, physically collapsing the cavalry formations. Around 15 o'clock hours, recognizing that the enemy he faced was an extension of a colossal main body, Bryennios sent an urgent request for reinforcements. Emperor Romanos IV. Diogenes, however, remained a prisoner of the flawed assumption that the enemy's main headquarters was still far away. Dismissing Bryennios's report as an exaggeration, he dispatched a relatively small armored unit under the command of Basilakis, the Duke of Theodosiopolis, as support. Upon arriving at the battlefield, Basilakis made an impulsive decision to pursue the retreating Seljuk forces. This was to fall victim to the most fundamental premise of the Seljuk feigned retreat tactic. Basilakis' unit was drawn kilometers away from the main camp, exhausted, and subsequently annihilated within the jaws of a closing crescent. Duke Basilakis was taken prisoner, and Bryennios, having sustained 2 arrow wounds to the chest, barely managed to return to camp. As the sun set on the evening of August 24th, the silence that descended upon the Eastern Roman headquarters was the silence of a hubristic illusion calcifying into a lethal realization. Alp Arslan was there, waiting with his main army just a few kilometers away. The morning of August 25th witnessed a tense standoff on the Manzikert plain. The main bodies of the two armies had entered each other's striking range, yet neither initiated an all-out offensive. Although minor vanguard skirmishes occurred throughout the day, the true battle was being fought over the geography itself. The Seljuk light cavalry had rapidly seized control of the tributaries of the Murat River and the viable freshwater sources, the most strategic assets in the region. Within the Byzantine camp, baking under the August sun, water rations began to plummet dramatically. Without access to water, maintaining the physical and mental integrity of tens of thousands of soldiers encased in Klibanion armor was a physiological impossibility. However, The ultimate devastation would not be geographical or physical, but entirely psychological and demographic. The darkness of the night linking August 25th to August 26th breached an irreparable hole in the logistical infrastructure of the war. The Eastern Roman army was far from a homogeneous entity. A significant portion of its ranks consisted of Turkic-origin mercenaries hired from the northern steppes, such as the Ouz and the Pechenegs. As the night deepened, the shifting winds carried the sounds of songs, chatter, and Turkish dialects from the Seljuk camp across no man's land and directly into the tents of the mercenaries. This auditory data drifting from the opposing camp, echoing their own language and cultural roots, served as the final catalyst that triggered their dissolution. Toward midnight, the Ouz and Pecheneg units silently dismantled their tents. In a planned, quiet, and mass movement, they abandoned the Eastern Roman ranks and crossed over to the Seljuk side under the cover of darkness. This act of defection was more than a mere numerical loss. When the sheer scale of the betrayal became apparent with the first light of dawn, a total communication paralysis gripped the Eastern Roman headquarters. Following the disappearance of Tarchanaiotes' army toward Alat, the most mobile units responsible for securing the army's flanks had now defected to the enemy. Even more disastrous was the irreparable paranoia that infected the chain of command. How could they trust the remaining mercenaries, the Franks, the Normans, or the Armenian detachments still residing in the camp? Even before the main engagement of the war had begun, Romanos Diogenes had lost half of both the physical mass and the psychological cohesion of his army to fractures within his own ranks. As the sun illuminated the plain on the morning of August 26th, the Eastern Roman army, plunged into strategic blindness, logistical collapse, and profound distrust, was about to march into one of the most meticulously engineered ambushes in history. On the morning of August 26, 1071, the atmosphere suspended over the Rava plain carried the sheer physical weight of impending demographic and military annihilation. As the first rays of the sun rapidly replaced the freezing cold of the high-altitude night with a scorching drought, a mechanical stir began within the Eastern Roman camp, a force that had been deprived of water for days. The geographical stage for the collision was a vast expanse sitting at an elevation of approximately 1,500 meters, punctuated by volcanic mounds and dried riverbeds. This topography presented a thoroughly hostile environment for the cumbersome advance of heavy infantry, yet offered an immaculate canvas for the high mobility of light cavalry. During the morning hours, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes deployed his army into battle formation in strict adherence to traditional Roman military doctrine. The battle line was arrayed facing east, stretching across a broad front of nearly 3 kilometers. Command of the center forces was held personally by the emperor, comprising the Imperial Guard, the elite Tagmata regiments, and the heavy infantry. Command of the right wing was delegated to the seasoned Cappadocian general Theodore Aliates, while the left wing was entrusted to Nikephoros Bryennios, who was still recovering from wounds sustained during the Vanguard clashes 2 days prior. However, the most critical and ultimately fatal component of this formation was the reserve force positioned behind the main line. Tasked with the vital role of supporting the primary army in the event of a withdrawal or a breach in the line, the command of this rearguard was handed to Andronikos Doukas, a representative of the civilian aristocracy and one of Romanos Diogenes' fiercest political rivals for the throne. Political fault lines originating kilometers away from the battlefield had now firmly embedded themselves into the tactical spine of the army. Opposite the Eastern Roman army, positioned with their backs to the sun, the formation of the Great Seljuk army was the product of a profoundly asymmetrical military philosophy. Sultan Alp Arslan had arrayed his forces not as a static wall, but in a colossal crescent spanning roughly 4 kilometers, its horns extending ominously toward the Byzantine flanks. The Seljuk apparatus of war was composed not of heavy infantry destined for close-quarters melee, but of highly mobile, lightly armored Turkmen horse archers. Stationed on a topographic elevation behind the center, Alp Arslan established a command post that afforded him a panoramic view of the entire battlefield, allowing him to relay orders to his wings in a matter of seconds. While the Sultan's elite Gulam regiments and heavy cavalry anchored the center of the crescent, Divisions of horse archers, with their maneuverability maximized, waited on the wings at an angle designed to envelop the Byzantine host. Approaching midday, at the very moment the sun reached its zenith and the thermal impact on military equipment peaked, Romanos Diogenes issued the order to attack. Accompanied by the blare of horns and the beating of drums, the colossal military mass of eastern Rome began its slow mechanical advance like a moving wall. This offensive, however, was a march into a calculated void rather than an engagement against a resisting force. As the Byzantine center pressed forward, the Seljuk center initiated a disciplined, methodical retreat, unleashing volleys of arrows as they withdrew. The feigned retreat, or as it is known in military literature, the Turan tactic, was executing its geometric application on the battlefield with millimeter-perfect precision. As the hours bled on, the Eastern Roman army found itself subjected not to a battle, but to a merciless endurance test. Burdened by lamellar armor, the Klibanion, weighing 15 to 20 kilograms, the infantry was pushed to the absolute brink of physical exhaustion under the relentless heat, severe dehydration, and choking clouds of dust. Romanos Diogenes, relentlessly driving his forces forward in pursuit of the retreating Seljuk center, remained dangerously unaware of how far he was drifting from his own camp and his rear reserves. Yet he could never quite force the Seljuk cavalry into the decisive melee engagement he sought. While the distance between the retreating Seljuk center and the advancing Byzantine main body remained constant, the Seljuk wings positioned at the tips of the crescent began to rain unending volleys of arrows upon the Byzantine flanks, actively severing them from the center and stretching their formation to the breaking point. The aerodynamically superior composite bows inflicted a continuous hemorrhage within the Byzantine ranks, compelling the infantry to raise their shield walls, a defensive posture that further decelerated their already agonizing pace. As late afternoon approached and topographic shadows began to lengthen, the Eastern Roman army found itself stranded in open terrain, entirely disconnected from its headquarters and having secured absolutely no strategic advantage. Rationally comprehending that he could not destroy the enemy's main body and that his army would face certain ambush in the darkness of night, Romanos Diogenes finally issued that critical, irreversible order around 18 o'clock hours: retreat. Since antiquity, the most hazardous military maneuver is an organized retreat executed while in contact with the enemy. The success of such an operation hinges entirely upon a flawless chain of command and the unshakable support of the reserve forces. Romanos signaled the retreat by turning the imperial standard back toward his own camp, the Vela signal. Yet, amidst the chaotic geometry of the battlefield and the thick dust suspended in the air, this visual signal morphed into a cascading cognitive disaster. The sight of the emperor pivoting and marching backward was perceived by elements on the extremities of the line not as a controlled tactical withdrawal, but as an indication that the emperor had been struck down or was fleeing. This cognitive fracture, compounding weeks of accumulated exhaustion, thirst, and paranoia, shattered the discipline of the shield wall in mere seconds. The geometry of the battle altered radically in that exact second. Observing the reversal of the Eastern Roman center, Alp Arslan issued the command from his vantage point to instantly halt the feigned retreat. The withdrawing Seljuk center abruptly wheeled their mounts around and charged into the rear of the Byzantine army with devastating kinetic energy. Simultaneously, the horns of the crescent swept around the Byzantine flanks, rapidly closing the encirclement. The engagement was no longer a pitched battle. It had transformed into an annihilation ring spanning hundreds of thousands of square meters. However, the ultimate death warrant for the Eastern Roman army was signed not by the Seljuk arrows striking from the front, but by a cold-blooded act of treason emanating from the command tents in the rear. Andronikos Doukas, tasked with protecting the rear of the retreating main army, acting as a shield and decelerating the enemy offensive, perceived the unfolding chaos on the battlefield as a historic opportunity for a dynastic coup. Instead of driving his fresh reserve force of tens of thousands forward to break the encirclement, Doukas deliberately propagated the rumor that the emperor is dead, the battle is lost, and ordered his troops to abandon the field. The reserves rapidly withdrew, surrendering their emperor and the main army to the encroaching Seljuk cavalry attacking from the rear. This severing of the logistical and command chain equated to slicing the very aorta of the Byzantine military. Witnessing the departure of the reserve forces and realizing their rear was left entirely defenseless, the right wing under Alyattes was the first formation to disintegrate. Under the weight of the Seljuk flank assaults, the right wing completely collapsed and was annihilated. The left-wing commander, Bryennios, managed with immense difficulty to salvage a portion of his troops, executing a desperate fighting retreat before the jaws of the encirclement snapped shut. But the central forces where Romanos Diogenes stood, the imperial guards and the heavy infantry, were totally enveloped. Every avenue of escape had been physically blockaded by Seljuk troops, communication networks had been severed, and the command echelon had evaporated. As the sun set blood-red beyond the western edge of the Manzikert plain, the final pockets of Byzantine resistance trapped within the closed crescent melted away one by one. After his horse was killed beneath him, Romanos Diogenes drew his sword and continued to fight on foot. Yet, the culmination of logistical miscalculations, strategic divisions, intelligence blindness, and ultimately the millimeter-perfect treason of Andronikos Doukas precipitated the collapse of the final defensive line manned by a few thousand men fighting shoulder to shoulder. By 21 o'clock hours, the geometry of the battle was complete. The main body of the Eastern Roman army had been erased from the face of the earth. As the dust clouds over the Rava plain gave way to a heavy silence on the night of August 26, 1071, military history was witnessing not merely the outcome of a battle, but the fracturing of the structural fault lines of an entire empire. In the final stages of the clash, entirely deprived of his protective shield and forced to fight on foot after his horse was killed by arrows, Eastern Roman Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was physically exhausted, having sustained a sword wound to his shoulder. In the advancing hours of the night, he was noticed and captured by an ordinary Seljuk gulam or slave soldier scanning the battlefield. This moment marked the first and only strategic instance since Emperor Valerianus was captured by the Sassanids in 260 AD. When Romanos Diogenes was brought to the headquarters tent of great Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan in chains, relegated to the status of a common prisoner of war, geopolitical balances were irreversibly shaken. The historic encounter between the two monarchs unfolded not as a primitive display of a victor humiliating the vanquished, but rather as a cold-blooded chess match of high diplomacy and psychological warfare. In response to Alp Arslan's analytical question posed to the captive emperor, "What would you do if I were brought before you as a prisoner?" Romanos Diogenes' honest yet hubristic reply, "I would have you flogged or paraded in chains through the streets of my capital," served as a summary of the Roman political mindset. The verdict delivered by Alp Arslan in return was a method of punishment far sharper than the sword: forgiveness and release. The peace treaty drafted in the tent over the following days was more than a military surrender. It was a cartographic blueprint that redrew the southern and eastern borders of Eastern Rome. The fortresses of Antioch, Edessa, Hierapolis, Manbij, and Manzikert were transferred to the Seljuks. A massive cash ransom of 1.5 million gold dinars was levied, and an annual tribute of 360,000 gold dinars was mandated. Furthermore, a strategic marital alliance was to be established between the two dynasties. Under these conditions, Romanos Diogenes embarked on a journey westward to reclaim his lost throne. However, the true defeat of Romanos Diogenes was unfolding not on the plains of Manzikert, but 1,000 kilometers to the west, within the marble palaces of Constantinople. When the news that the battle was lost and the emperor captured reached the capital, Caesar John Doukas, the father of Andronikos Doukas, the architect of the betrayal, immediately orchestrated a palace coup. Romanos Diogenes' stepson Michael VII was elevated to the throne as the new emperor, and Romanos Diogenes was de facto declared an enemy of the state. All clauses of the treaty signed with Alp Arslan were unilaterally annulled. In a matter of seconds, he had been transformed from a legitimate emperor into a treasonous rebel attempting to invade his own country. Realizing the situation as he advanced deeper into Anatolia, Romanos Diogenes engaged in a desperate civil war to reclaim his throne with makeshift units hastily assembled from the empire's eastern provinces. Yet the commander of the Eastern Roman army sent to confront him was none other than Andronikos Doukas himself, the very man who had stabbed him in the back and abandoned the battlefield at Manzikert. The two armies clashed in the region of Cilicia near modern-day Adana. The forces of Romanos Diogenes, entirely depleted both logistically and morally, were effortlessly defeated by Doukas's army. Taking refuge in the fortress of Adana, the deposed emperor surrendered on the condition that his life would be spared. However, the political morality of the era did not permit the execution of this agreement. In June of 1072, near Klibanion, modern-day Kütahya, all promises made to him were disregarded, and a brutal forensic form of punishment was inflicted upon the former emperor. Romanos Diogenes was laid flat on the back of a mule, and his eyes were gouged out by an inexperienced executioner using a red-hot iron rod. This procedure was carried out in such a bloody and infection-prone manner that the deposed emperor died in agonizing pain from a severe infection festering in his eye sockets, shortly after being exiled to a monastery on Proti, or Kinaliada, an island in the Sea of Marmara. His body was interred in an unmarked grave on the island. The tragic death of Romanos Diogenes and the Doukas dynasty's refusal to recognize the Seljuk treaty were the underlying causes that created the colossal geopolitical vacuum destined to alter world history. When the peace treaty signed by Alp Arslan was torn up by Eastern Rome, the Seljuk state was legally bound by no borderlines whatsoever. Moreover, there remained neither an army nor a command structure nor a central authority in Anatolia capable of halting these incursions. Turkmen tribes and Seljuk commanders began to pour like a ceaseless flood into the vast, defenseless and unpoliced peninsula stretching before them. The Battle of Manzikert shattered every lock behind those gates from the inside out, laying the groundwork for this monumental transformation. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions in the comments, so we can keep creating even better content for you. Hope to see you in the next video.